It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. And today we come to you live from the Greene Space with lots of politics, real and fake. We will talk about two dynamics in the Democratic presidential race, the gender-scripted trait of likability, and what makes a candidate catch fire on social media, what they call internet-y smarts, and how representative is that? Also, our Trump Inc. team has a take today on the 10 years of Trump tax returns data that the Times just published, and a certain Mar-a-Lago bar tab paid for by you. You will hear about that today. And New Yorker humorist Andy Borowitz brings the news that's so funny because it could be true from the Borowitz report later in the show. All that coming up, but our lead guests here in the Greene Space today are WNYC City Hall and Politics reporter Bridget Bergen and Mara Gay from the New York Times editorial board, who used to be a City Hall reporter for the Wall Street Journal and the Daily News. They are here on Mayor de Blasio's 58th birthday, a day when he is not announcing a run for president. Hi, Bridget and Mara. Welcome back to WNYC.
Thanks for having me.
Good morning.
I don't see any candles. You didn't come with candles.
We could sing if you want.
It's up to you. Bridget, we can tell people that behind the scenes, we knew you might have to cancel on us this morning because if the mayor announced the presidential run today, you would have to cover it. Why were people thinking it could be today?
So there's a couple reasons. I think going all the way back to the beginning of the year, the mayor has been sending out signals pretty clearly that his interests lie in a more national conversation about progressive politics. And then more specifically in terms of organizing a campaign, he set up a PAC last year, and staff from that PAC has been actively working to help him get out and spread that message. And we were hearing, a lot of us in the press corps, that this would be the week. Our friend Anna Sanders from the Daily News even reported on Friday that this was going to be the week. And then on Monday, Mayor de Blasio was on New York One, and when asked by Errol Lewis whether or not this was going to be the week, said no, in fact, it was not the night and not the week, and so we will all sort of hit pause. And that came after some staff shakeup that happened with that PAC last week. Someone who had been working for City Hall, a guy named Mike Casca, who had moved over to work on the PAC. He was an alumni of the Bernie Sanders 2016 campaign. He decided to both leave the PAC and his duties at City Hall entirely. So we are in what seems to be a little bit of a reconfiguring phase for the mayor. I think those of us who were pretty certain that we were on the verge of an announcement now feel like we're still likely on the verge of an announcement, but we're in maybe a little bit of a holding pattern.
Mara, I never thought he would do it on his birthday, even though there was speculation, because it would make it look like he was about, celebrating himself as opposed to serving. But you have a skeptical face.
It wouldn't have been a good idea. Maybe I'll leave it at that. But
Right. And this appearance on New York One where he said he's still deciding and will not announce a decision either way this week at all, 22 other people have figured it out by now, or is it 21, and jumped into the race. Others, like Michael Bloomberg, have considered it and announced that they would not run. What's your best understanding of the delay for de Blasio one way or the other?
Well, I think, this is a mayor who has a tough enough time making a decision about what to do with a sanitation announcement or a housing announcement. So the idea that he's struggling about whether or not to run for president as a long shot candidate, frankly, is unsurprising. I haven't looked at any internal polling or anything like that, but I think it's safe to say that it would be a long shot announcement. Now, look, you look at the current state of affairs, I think a lot of politicians out there see President Trump and they say, well, why not me? And that's hard to argue with. But it is an issue, I think, in part of, if you're the mayor, do you want to run for president, even if you likely won't win?
And Bridget, I see that the mayor just unveiled a new health care card to connect 300,000 uninsured people in the Bronx, I think all in the Bronx for the moment, with primary care providers. The mayor says he is building universal coverage at the city level. Can you remind us of the context for the card he unveiled yesterday?
Sure. So this is the next phase of an announcement he actually initially unveiled in January. It's part of a program called NYCHA, and it's a program that is intended to help folks who are either can't afford or undocumented to access medical care and to keep them from going to emergency rooms, but instead ensure they get primary care. And there has been a little bit of debate about whether or not this actually constitutes a form of, insurance, healthcare insurance for these folks, or if this is really more of a way to market some services that the city already provided and give people, more awareness that they have access to it by giving them this card. Making sure people go to see their primary care doctor is a good thing, and ensuring there are more primary care doctors that people can go to is a good thing. And that's part of what this program will do. These cards are going to be rolled out starting in the Bronx on August 1st. So we still aren't quite to lift off on the program, but it is part of this program that, when the mayor initially announced it, he announced it in an article in the Washington Post. So again, this is, that signaling that he was giving us back at the beginning of this year, that his sort of was setting his sights on a more national stage for some of these policy conversations.
He's running for mayor of D.C. That's what you're telling us, right?
Exactly.
It is a good precursor to announcing a presidential run, though, right? While we're waiting for a federal system, I brought universal coverage to the biggest city in America. Would that be a fair claim, Mara?
Well, no, I think the city's Health and Hospitals Corporation has been around a very long time. It's certainly fair to say that this is a mayor who came to office promising to address income inequality and specifically help poor New Yorkers, and that he has dedicated more money to this system to shore it up. So it's not hypocritical necessarily. I think it's just an issue of what's really new here. And, I don't know that the cards that he's touting provide a new entitlement, if that makes sense.
And I think part of what we see him doing here in terms of his communication strategy is he is taking advantage of some of these policy announcements to get onto a national stage. But one of the challenges when the national stage is often also right here in New York City is some of those same reporters who have been covering you in City Hall are now the reporters who are also part of that national conversation. And so I think back just a couple weeks ago during when it was Earth Day, and we were talking about some of the newest announcements related to his, and the city's Green New Deal. He went on Morning Joe, and he was going to have a conversation about, the city's plans to limit emissions from city buildings. And as opposed to having Joe Scarborough conduct that interview, he turned to his left, and it was our old friend John Lemire, AP reporter, now covering the White House, asking some of those questions. And unfortunately, the conversation went from just talking about the mayor's, unfortunate for the mayor, the conversation was not just about building emissions, but it was also about, well, do you think your policies for the environment are consistent when you drive 11 miles from Gracie Mansion to the Y every morning to work out?
In Park Slope.
In Park Slope. And that's the type of conversation that is, going to dog him no matter what he does, because some of those same reporters who have been covering him in City Hall are going to be covering him wherever he goes on the campaign trail.
Listeners, if you're just joining us, it's the Brian Lehrer Show live in the Greene Space today. By the way, when we're in the Greene Space, you can watch us as well as listen. We're streaming live video at WNYC.org or on the WNYC Facebook page. Our first guests are WNYC City Hall and Politics reporter Bridget Bergen and Mara Gay from the New York Times editorial board, where she writes about things local and national, but she also used to be a City Hall reporter when she was at the Daily News and the Wall Street Journal. And this is Mayor de Blasio's 58th birthday today, so we're talking about why he's not throwing his hat in the ring for president this week, as a lot of people expected he would do, and related things. And listeners, we can take your phone calls at 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. Do you want Bill de Blasio to run for president? How do you think he's doing at running the city? or anything related, or if you want to ask our guest a question, 212-433-9692. I'm curious, Greene Space audience, we have, secret ballot in the United States, so you don't have to raise your hands or not for this question. But how many of you here are willing to say you voted for Bill de Blasio for mayor at any time? So that's a lot of people. Of you, how many of you think he should not run for president? The laugh you hear, ladies and gentlemen, in Radio Land is that the exact same number of people who raised their hands saying they voted for de Blasio appeared to raise their hands and saying he should not run for president. If any of you are willing to say out loud how you square those two things, I'd be curious to hear it. So raise your hand if you want somebody to come around with a mic and say why, if you voted for the guy and maybe voted for the guy twice, maybe even think he's doing a decent job as mayor, do you think he shouldn't run for president? So if anybody's willing to do that, we've got people with microphones so we can come around. And listeners, same question for you if you want to call in, 212-433 WNYC 433-9692. Mara, there's a piece in the Times. Let me find it. I thought I had it here. Sorry, but there's a piece. Okay, so I'm going to have to paraphrase this this headline, but it's something like, as de Blasio weighs mayoral run, he's dogged by ethics questions.
The cloud.
The cloud, an ethics cloud. Thank you. Can you and it's both about the past and about the present. Can you talk about the present aspects of that?
Sure. So the mayor right now has been raising money for this presidential run, or would-be presidential run, with something called the Fairness PAC, which is a federal PAC. And he, in doing so, has been taking and seeking donations from people who are doing business with the city or hoping to do business with the city. There was, in particular, one case where we had a Boston developer who held a fundraiser for the mayor last month, and that developer is looking to expand his company's footprint in New York City and has just recently hired a former senior de Blasio official. So, by federal rules, I actually don't believe that it's not necessarily a legal issue. I think that there's certainly an ethical issue here. I mean, you really don't want the mayor kind of giving special access to the city and its contracts and its riches, really, to people who are donating to his campaign. And this has been an issue that has dogged him for years with other PACs and other entities, fundraising entities that he's created.
Now I found that headline, ethics cloud hangs over de Blasio as he weighs presidential run. And he and I have gone back and forth on the show over the last few weeks on this. Here's one-minute exchange from last Friday when I asked about the report in the news organization The City that showed how close the link was between donors to his possible presidential run and their lobbyists asking for things from City Hall. This starts with my question. City news organization used the example of the law firm of Abrams Fensterman. In the fall of 2018, two partners wrote 3 checks to your PAC totaling $15,000. At the time, they'd retained 2 lobbyist firms, Brian Cave and Satire, to influence the office of mayor on zoning changes that could significantly impact their real estate clients. So if your deputy mayor or commissioner meets with those real estate lobbyists who might be hired by your donors, the public shouldn't have any concerns about that?
No, listen to what I'm saying. I really feel like I'm being very clear here. I'm going to say it again. The public has a right to know, and unlike any previous administration in the city, we are giving you that full vision. Now, where I come from, Brian, that's something that people in the media and watchdogs should say, hey, that's great. Because you're obviously, if you're very comfortable showing us exactly who met with who, then you must not have anything to hide, and that is the truth.
So that was on last Friday's show. Bridget, you can react to that content per se if you want, but I'm also curious if this weeks-long story here in New York comes up when he's visiting early primary states?
So I have not yet gone with him when he's left New York, and if he leaves New York again, I most likely will. But one of the things that I think is interesting about this story, and it reminds me of the 2017 mayoral campaign. These issues are complicated, and they're hard to translate to a broader audience. The notion of raising money in exchange, a pay-to-play environment, makes sense. But when you start getting into the details of it is not necessarily the issue that when you're sitting across from someone at a diner in Iowa is necessarily going to be at the top of the issues that affect their life. And so while I think that it's our job to raise these issues in terms of holding the mayor accountable, we didn't see it have any impact on his 2017 mayoral campaign. Some of this type of scrutiny was happening throughout 2016. He was under multiple investigations while he was never charged with anything. When the Manhattan DA's office and the U.S. Attorney's office announced in a very unusual move that they were not going to charge him, it was with what was essentially a scold to say that he had violated the intent and spirit of the law. So, these are conversations that have been happening, and they have not necessarily moved voters to this point.
And I could see, Mar, how there's a broad disconnect. Tell me if you think there is, and I don't know if you've gone on any of the trips with him, but between de Blasio's press coverage and interaction with voters out there versus here. Because here I feel like we talk about campaign finance and NYCHA and homelessness and Rikers and rezoning, and none of that even comes up when he's talking out there, or am I missing it?
No, that's right. I mean, look, all politics is local, right? So if you've had a mayor for a term and a half, essentially years, everyone in the city is going to have some complaint about him. It could be a street light, which, we hear those folks call into your show often, and I love that because it really keeps the mayor humble, I think. But it could be about his affordable housing plan or his pre-K plan working or not working the way people want it to. So that's not going to translate to a national audience, and I actually think that's part of why the mayor, understandably, has so much more fun out on the campaign trail. I mean, who wouldn't? Who wouldn't?
Let's take a phone call. We're going to go to Alice on line 3 in Park Slope. Alice, you're on WNYC. Hi there.
Hi. Thanks for answering my call. I'm really pleased. So, yes, I've been a lifelong resident of Park Slope, and the mayor did live right near me. And I can say that people here dislike him intensely. I can't think of a soul that I know who would vote for him again, except for the fact that he's a Democrat.
But wait,
and in New York, as you know, Democrats win.
May I ask?
So there's no one to vote against him.
Did you vote for him twice in the general election?
I voted for him once.
First time?
Yep.
And did you vote for him in the primary that year too?
No, I did not.
Right, okay. And do you think it's just for you as, a one-person focus group convener in Park Slope, do you think that a lot of people who've gotten turned off to him were fans, thought he was doing a good job early on, anything like that?
I think there were some, but I don't know if you're aware of the fact, but Park Slope Patch, which is one of these local paper kind of things, has reported that there's a sign in his gym saying that no member here should run for president.
Right. Yeah. Somebody put that sign. Alice, thank you. Who put that sign up in the gym?
I don't know if we know who put the sign up.
It's just a protest. It's not the gym itself.
No. I mean, and I will, to piggyback a little bit on what Alice said, a few weeks ago, I went to Park Slope on a Sunday and reported a story the same day the mayor was actually out in Nevada, stumping with voters. And I went into it, I will say, with this, having talked to friends and advisors of the mayors, and one of the things that they will often say is what the media misses about Bill de Blasio's success in the past, the fact that he's never lost an election, is that he has a relationship with voters that is not reflected in the coverage that he receives. And so I said, okay, let's go out and talk to the voters. Let's go to Park Slope. Let's go to his neighborhood hotspots and find folks who must help me understand what that relationship is.
But it might be that was the wrong spot, actually, even though he lives there. And I'm going to further that thought by taking line 10, Jose in Woodside next. Jose, you're on WNYC. Hi.
My call. I voted for de Blasio, and I will always vote for the man because I really think, even though I had doubts when he first started running for office, I really had a lot of doubts about it. For all of the reasons that everybody talks about, the doubts that they have, I had the same doubts. But over the years, I've come to trust the man's word, which is different from what's reported. And as a consequence, I would not want him to run for president, only because as difficult as it has been in New York for him, with the press, it would be even more difficult in Washington, and you can even accomplish even less in Washington, I think, as a president. And then the public is so fragmented and so divided, and I mean, you talk to 5 people, they'll tell you 5 different things.
You don't want him to run for president
because they never agree on anything.
You just don't want him. You want to protect him. You want to protect him from all that aggravation of being
absolutely.
president.
I think he can do better with his life than waste it on. Because I think it would be a waste.
For you, what's the best thing or best 2 things that he's done as mayor?
I think he has brought the city. Bloomberg brought the city together a lot. But I see, after Trump, he has done a tremendous job of bringing the people together because there was this divide between the whites and the minorities in New York after Trump. And I always see it because I look at people and I see how they react to me, and that reaction tells me a lot about where their heads are at any given moment. And I ride the subways and all the time, so I see what's going down. And over the last couple of years, I've seen it change back to what it was before Trump.
Jose, thank you.
And that, I think, is all because of
de Blasio.
De Blasio.
Thank you very much, Jose. We appreciate your call. And Mara, you wrote a column in February about the mayor starting to campaign in places like Iowa called Mayor de Blasio, Where Did the Love Go? So that was about the flirtation with higher office coming as he's getting less popular here at home. But you also do note in that piece part of what Jose was pointing out, which is there's a big racial divide in New York City about Bill de Blasio, which is why his mostly white neighborhood of Park Slope might not be the best place to gauge his popularity as opposed to other neighborhoods.
Right, and that piece was essentially about the mayor cheating on the city of New York. Because I joke about that, but, I think something that my colleagues and I missed, at least early on, was the amount of hunger and, in some ways, even just desperation and then later relief that was felt among Black and Latino New Yorkers specifically. Just hearing the mayor of the city of New York, whoever that be, speak to them as full citizens of the city and full constituents. Putting it into context, that was not done under the Bloomberg administration for a dozen years, or at least lots of people felt that way. And I think that Mayor de Blasio really does communicate with Black voters better than any politician I've seen on the national stage other than Barack Obama. I think that's probably his greatest strength. I've written about it before. It's super interesting. His numbers have fallen among Black voters as well as other voters, but that connection did get him through the 2017 re-election campaign. And I think even if he hasn't always delivered, in my opinion, for those voters the way he promised, I do think that other politicians should kind of look at that and take some lessons.
You just said he connects better with Black voters than anybody other than Barack Obama that you've seen. You mean including other Black politicians?
I would agree. I mean, I don't want to say, it's Barack Obama and then Bill de Blasio necessarily, but I do think that he's really up there in the way he's able to communicate.
So I can see, Bridget, where his people could make a case for why he would stand a chance in the presidential race based on that some of the white progressive favorites like Bernie Sanders and Pete Buttigieg are having trouble getting Black support, according to the polls, and are working hard to build that credibility in communities of color. Bernie's doing better than in 2016 from what I see, but it's still an issue. De Blasio's base in New York is African American. He's in a mixed family. He's from the progressive wing. In addition, and he created universal pre-K, universal primary care, paid sick leave and a $15 minimum wage. So in theory, he could conceive of himself as a fusion candidate. Is that part of the rationale?
I think to Mara's point that he has had a history of being able to, and successfully talking to Black voters and brown voters in New York City in a way that certainly Mayor Bloomberg did not. In sort of in my own reporting, before I did the Park Slope story, I can't remember the order, but I also spent a lot of time at the National Action Network conference where he was also speaking, and the audience
Al Sharpton's group,
right, and the audience for that is a largely Black and African American group of very engaged voters, and I was curious to see if in that type of audience, if you would start to hear people who are a little bit more open to the candidacy, to the possibility of a candidacy.
And many, many, many of these presidential hopefuls came to speak at that conference recently.
Many of them. And the day that Mayor de Blasio was speaking, he actually was speaking just before someone who's not running, but who is really a dynamo right now, Stacey Abrams, candidate for governor in Georgia. It was one of those moments that was really striking to me because a lot of what has become part of the stump speech for Mayor de Blasio at this point, some of the lines that those of us who cover him regularly have heard many times, talking about how there's enough money in the world, but it's in the wrong hands. It fell in a very tepid way in this room because the energy there was, they were waiting for Stacey Abrams. People wanted to hear from her. So while I think it is true that he does connect with Black and brown voters better than some other politicians, I'm not sure if in this field at this moment, if he is the right messenger. And that's also what I've been hearing from other analysts who've looked at this race.
We have a question here in the Greene Space. Hi there.
Hi there.
Go ahead.
I have a question which is, so I happen to love this mayor. So I'm coming from a different perspective. The first election, my hometown paper told me not to vote for the mayor because he had a lot of dreams and they would never come to fruition. It was a waste of a vote.
What was this hometown paper?
Oh,
Queens Chronicle, the Brooklyn Eagle? What was the hometown paper?
The New York Times.
I've heard of it.
And without enough information, I went that way, and immediately these pie-in-the-sky dreams came true, saving me $18,000 a year in childcare. And I happened to have friends deep in the administration who would report, who I saw working with great integrity, beautiful people, who could tell me that the mayor had true values that reflected our own, was a deeply ethical person. And I began to see the news reports in a very different way, always missing the facts. So I'm not actually personally tied in any way to his candidacy or, probably would not vote for him amongst this field of wonderful candidates the Democrats have. But I don't hear any facts, and not a single fact, to be honest, to say this mayor is unethical, this mayor is, any of the things that we get impressions of. Yes, he takes a car 11 miles, but shouldn't we, I feel like on your show, Brian, last week, Brian McKibben was saying, let's forget about turning on and off the lights here.
Bill McKibben, the
environmentalist.
Uh-huh.
Let's focus on national and international policy changes, because we're beyond that. And here we're spending a lot of time talking about whether this candidate isn't the best candidate in the world, while we have a field of wonderful candidates who can also support. Or, of course, the opposite is happening at the White House right now. So is there any one fact that we can say, hey, this is a bad mayor? And if not, can we just drop it and say he's a man who is entitled to go to his gym, to run for president? And you know what? He's done some amazing things. He truly believes that everyone should have affordable housing. And he has focused his energies, it seems to me, on creating policies that jibe with the values and ethics, I would guess, of everyone in this room and everyone listening. That's my guess.
Many
more or
listening.
less. It's many.
Many
Let's say
in this room. You
much
don't
of it.
know.
So it's a lot of berating without real facts. Just like he lives in our neighborhood. He's one of us. Come on, just lower your expectations a little bit. Be perfect in some way that's totally unattainable.
I'm just curious for you, besides if you want to apply for communications director, I think you do better than a lot of people out there in the professional field. Is it your sense, among other people you know personally, that their support for de Blasio has declined over the course of his terms? And if so, do you think that's driven by media narratives that they're consuming, or just ways that he's coming across to them? Or what's your own sense of whether people you know who voted for him at the beginning too line up with where you are now, and if not, why not?
There is definitely a media narrative. You cited a headline earlier. That's, again, one of these speculative, it's sort of name-calling without any basis. To answer your question directly, the enthusiasm has waned. The guy is not the world's best communicator. He may not be the most organized person in the world. These are inherent flaws for him that may stifle his national ambitions. But I feel like as New Yorkers living in a city, we have all these problems all the time. We wish we were better. It's easy to see a headline that says, there's some question about corruption, so he's a corrupt. Let's move on, without any basis.
So keep our eye on the ball of what he's actually doing. Thank you very much for your comment. I really appreciate it. We're almost out of time. Mara, in your article in February, Where Did the Love Go? It came just as the problems in NYCHA public housing were most in the news, and President Trump's appointee for overseeing NYCHA, Lynn Patton, was beginning a month's worth of sleeping in NYCHA buildings to immerse herself in the people and their living conditions as the mayor was starting to spend more time out of town. And you wrote, if the mayor isn't careful, New Yorkers might seek comfort elsewhere, too, like, say, from Lynn Patton, the Trump party planner turned regional housing administrator, who, from the looks of it, is available. Now, as it happens, Lynn Patton was on the show yesterday to talk about NYCHA and being a Trump supporter. I asked her about the court-supervised consent decree with the city that requires the city to spend only $2 billion more over 10 years and no requirement for more federal spending, despite NYCHA's estimate that it needs $32 billion to really make those buildings decent again. And here's what she said.
That pursuit should not be partisan. We should all want to know what the accurate capital needs number is. A lot of politicians, I won't name them, but a lot of politicians, a lot of private developers, they tell me that number is ridiculous. They tell me that a lot of that number has to do with union wages. It's not okay. First of all, that number also breaks down to about $181,000 per unit. You try going up to your private landlord tonight and telling him you want him to invest $181,000 into your apartment, and let me know how that goes for you.
So who should be making less?
Well, I know for a fact the Federal Monitor has asked for a list of everybody at NYCHA that makes more than $150,000 a year, and unfortunately there's a lot of them. We are going to be making determinations about where the money is best served. We owe it to the taxpayers, we owe it to the residents. And again, this is not a political thing. I would hope that everyone would want to use this money wisely.
Lynn Patton on yesterday's show. Mara, you wrote a critical column about the lack of federal dollars when that consent decree was first agreed to in January. What did you think about that answer and Lynn Patton questioning the realness of the $32 billion figure and throwing a dart at the fact that a lot of people make over $150,000 who work for NYCHA?
I mean, look, the city and cities across the country have gotten a raw deal from the federal government on housing and public housing for years. This is really nothing new. It's also certainly true that the city can probably cut down on some expenses and probably needs to more fully rework its labor agreements to get some of those costs down in NYCHA, which is the city's public housing authority.
And did you mean, were you just being cheeky in that piece, or do you think she's actually interested in running for mayor in 2021?
I was being cheeky.
Okay, just making sure. You never know. And Bridget, before you go, you broke some news recently that led to a change at the Board of Elections. You revealed that anybody could look up any registered voter's home address.
Yeah, so voter registration data is public data, but it was always public data that you had to go and get. And because of state legislation that moved the primary date up and all the assorted issues with candidates that came along with that, the board decided that their quick fix was to just put it all up online, which they did, and where it lived for about a month, more than a month, for a while, until actually a listener tipped me off to it because he was checking out his neighbors. And when I went, and so when I went and looked at it, it was striking to me because, we've done a lot of reporting on voters and voter data here at WNYC, and this was definitely a break in policy, a change in policy. And when I asked the board why, their answer was that the printer was not going to be able to print the books in time. And so that we could just go down a whole rabbit hole, looking at that kind of answer. But ultimately, after the story went up, and then the New York Times also did a really good follow-up piece, the commissioners had a conversation, and I think they were getting some blowback, and they decided to take the information down. It is still a public record. You can still go to the Board of Elections and look anybody up, and you can still go and buy a copy of the voter roll. You just can't be sitting in your bed at 2 o'clock in the morning snooping on your neighbors.
And Bridget deserves a lot of love and respect, because it's not often that a journalist gets a change in policy that quickly by pointing out something that can be threatening. And she's also the person who broke the story in 2016 about thousands of people in Brooklyn who thought they were registered being removed from the rolls before the Democratic presidential primary that year. So they changed something after that, too. So on that note, please thank WNYC's Bridget Bergen and Mara Gay from the editorial board of the New York Times. Thank you so much. And a lot more to come here in the Greene Space. Stay with us.
On the next All of It, Christy Turlington-Burns will join me in studio. After experiencing post-pregnancy complications, she co-founded Every Mother Counts, a nonprofit focused on helping make pregnancy and childbirth safe for women around the world. Plus, a new production of Antigone in Ferguson kicks off this week in Brooklyn. Tickets are free, and the Theater of War production will star, among others, New York City public advocate Jumaane Williams. I'm Allison Stewart. Don't miss All of It, weekdays at noon on WNYC.
Support for WNYC comes from Geico Insurance, celebrating over 75 years of providing auto insurance for drivers across America. Geico can also help insure motorcycles, RVs, homes, apartments, and more. Information at geico.com or 1-800-947-AUTO. Neon, presenting The Biggest Little Farm, the true story of a couple who traded city living to embrace nature and revitalize 200 acres of barren farmland, opens Friday at Angelica Film Center, Landmark at 57 West and Alamo Drafthouse, Brooklyn. WNYC is a media sponsor of the Penn World Voices Festival, where audiences can experience storytelling and ideas with more than 200 authors, artists, and activists from May 6th to 12th. Details at pennworldvoices.org.
WNYC, independent journalism in the public interest. 93.9 FM and AM 820. NPR News and the New York Conversation.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC, live in the Greene Space today. And when we are in the Greene Space, you can watch as well as listen. We're streaming live video at WNYC.org or on the WNYC Facebook page. Now we continue a conversation that we've been having on the show about electability in the context of the presidential race, and how, especially in the absence of concrete evidence, our prejudices can take root when determining who can or cannot win, in our opinions. With 21 candidates, including 6 women, 2 African Americans, a Samoan American, and a Taiwanese American, people's assumptions about electability are being interrogated like never before. So let's interrogate 2 more aspects of electability or perceived electability with 2 guests who have published articles in the Times in the last few days. One aspect is likability. The other is so-called internetability, going viral on social media. My guests are Claire Bond-Potter, professor of history at the New School, and Vice News correspondent Jay Caspian Kang. But your article was in the Times, right?
Yeah, I'm just at the Times now.
Oh, you're just at the Times. Sorry. So thanks for coming in. Thanks for coming to the Greene Space. Claire, you try in your piece to trace the history of likability as a concept in American politics. So how far back did your research take you?
Oh, it took me way far back. So when I first thought of the idea, I thought, oh, it must be 2009 when we're all liking things on Facebook, right? But the more I dug into it, the more it sort of propelled me back into the 19th century, where men liking each other was sort of a synonym for trusting each other, and liking others and being liked became really important. And that sort of propels itself into the advice literature of marketing and advertising. And so where likability enters politics precisely is in 1952 with the Eisenhower campaign, the slogan of which was, "I like Ike." With an Irving Berlin jingle and so on and so forth. So likability becomes sort of embedded in politics at a moment when politicians are going on television and large media campaigns by advertising agencies are being mounted on their behalf.
Jay, your piece is titled "Pete Buttigieg's Meaningless Erudition Made Him the Smart Candidate." So sure. What does smart mean and what does meaningless mean in this context?
Well, meaningless, I think, meant that a lot of the things that I was seeing, both on social media but also from my colleagues in the media itself, and especially within opinion columnists, was this idea that the sort of resume that Pete Buttigieg had put together, which is impressive. He went to Harvard, he was a Rhodes Scholar, and he allegedly spoke 7 or 8 languages, like that somehow was a stand-in for him being really a great presidential candidate. And the thing that bothered me about it wasn't that people were sort of fawning over, sort of like an Ivy League guy. It was more that the other candidates seemed to have the exact same, like maybe they didn't speak 7 languages, but as we found in the article, like Pete Buttigieg doesn't really either. He says he can order a sandwich in 7 languages in his book. And so that sort of drift from, people who have almost the same, like almost everyone running is an Ivy Leaguer. Almost everyone running has like an impressive past. Why was it that a 37-year-old mayor from South Bend, Indiana, was being touted as being so much smarter than somebody like Elizabeth Warren, who has, a much more blue-collar background, who really sort of, was a policy expert for decades? Like, why did that happen? So that was the question that I tried to answer.
And you point out how some of the media are gushing over Buttigieg, like Ryan Lizza of Esquire asked him if running for president was more like Ulysses or more like Finnegan's Wake. See, audience, backstory. I told the audience before the show that Finnegan's Wake and Ulysses would come up.
Yeah, that was, I just remember, there was like a whole day where I felt like there was a fissure amongst the media, and some people were being like, this is great, like he can speak coherently about Ulysses, and the other half were like, well, what does this have to do with anything, And I fell on one side, but like I just, that was, and then there's several articles about like his favorite books, and these are sort of being passed around as being evidence. And just like, look, the rest of them also can read. They also have favorite books. And why is it better for one's favorite book to be Ulysses or like a Norwegian novel and not like like some work of history that informs their policies? Like this answer just never materialized for me, so I was frustrated by that.
And listeners, I also told the audience before the show that Moby Dick would come up as well, but that's not going to be until Andy Borowitz comes on later. So you'll just have to wait for it. Claire, how do you see likability as a gendered trait, which your article asserts that it is, in the way that it's used or in public perception or in its origins?
Well, likability was created by men for men. And so for women to fit into likability, it's really a tough sell. I mean, I think, thinking about what Brian said about how Pete Buttigieg's intellectual abilities are being touted, what do we have to say about Elizabeth Warren? She's a wonky professor, right? And so there is this way in which qualities that are considered very likable in men are considered unlikable in women. And one of the points I make in the article is that we actually don't fantasize about women as strong leaders or tough negotiators or thoughtful policymakers. But when we hear that a man has the intelligence to, maybe negotiate a treaty with North Korea, then we are all in. Or, that he reads Finnegan's Wake. Nobody reads Finnegan's Wake. I just want to say that, okay?
Yeah. But and I can confirm that I took a raise hands poll of the Greene Space audience before and nobody had
read. None of you did.
They hadn't read the Mueller report either, but they didn't read Finnegan's Wake.
I read the Mueller report, but I'm a wonk, so.
Some of them did read Moby Dick, though. Over and over, we heard that Hillary Clinton wasn't likable. Here's a famous cringeworthy clip from a 2008 Clinton-Obama debate.
Those of you on this stage, you are the most experienced and the most electable. What can you say to the voters of New Hampshire on this stage tonight who see your resume and like it, but are hesitating on the likability issue, where they seem to like Barack Obama more?
Well, that hurts my feelings.
I'm sorry, Senator. I'm sorry.
But I'll try to go on. He's very likable. I agree with that. I don't think I'm that bad.
You're likable enough.
Thank you so much.
Cringe. People are cringing all over again in the Greene Space audience. Listeners, you couldn't see it. Claire Bon-Potter, deconstruct that moment in the context of your article.
Well, of course, one of the things people said immediately after that happened was that it reflected very badly on Obama, and it was like being transported back to high school where the prom king was going after the woman who gets elected treasurer of the class because nobody else wants it. And I think, what is interesting about that is that Hillary herself had brought up the question of likability. In fact, before she launched her presidential campaign, she launched something called a Likeability tour, which was similar to the listening tour that she had launched before her Senate campaign. But that was because the people who were handling her knew that she had likability problems. One of the things I would suggest is that Hillary's approval ratings were highest when her husband was treating her most badly. And that once she actually began to have her own accomplishments, her likability began to slide precipitously. And so one theory I would put out there is it's easy to like women when they are in the position of being injured, right? And that clip is a perfect example of it. Hillary actually won that primary, and there are many people that attribute that moment to her victory. But it's much more difficult to like women when they start having accomplishments and when they start getting out there competing with men for the kinds of things that men are supposed to do.
You reference, as you said before, not only the political history, but the sort of business and self-help history. You mentioned in your article the classic 1936 book, Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. Was he writing about likability per se? Did he use that word?
He used the word like a lot. And it was interesting, two of the texts, the other one was Horatio Alger. I went to the Google Books and just put like in, and it came up something like 230 times for Ragged Dick. I put it in for Dale Carnegie, and it came up over 100 times. So the idea of liking was being touted as this crucial connection between people that not only made businesses work, but made careers happen. What's interesting, of course, is Carnegie says you can easily, by trying too hard to make people like you, they start to dislike you. And the examples he gives of that are women. There's a woman named Henrietta G., who was one of the most productive people in her office, but she bragged about her accomplishments. And as I thought later, well, if she had been Henry G., would people have actually liked her for her accomplishments?
I wonder, Jay, if you have thought, since you wrote about Buttigieg and, what they call internet-y intelligence, or did you coin that phrase? Do
A
people
friend
say,
of mine said it.
yeah, internet-y intelligence. And you referred before to things that some candidates do online more than others, getting a lot of likes on Facebook or elsewhere. Have you thought about whether like on the internet in 2019 means the same thing as like the way Dale Carnegie might have used it in 1936?
Well, I think the gendered components of it are still pretty striking. I always think about like why Elizabeth Warren is running the campaign she's running, where she seems to put out a policy paper every Monday, and where she's just like, I have a plan for that. And I think that in some ways it's a response to what you were talking about with the Hillary campaign, where she is trying to figure out a way where she can minimize her personality. And it might not, I don't think it's because Elizabeth Warren is an unlikable person or that she thinks or anyone in her campaign thinks that way. But she doesn't think, I think, and I think she is correct about this, that she can do what Pete Buttigieg does and just sort of go out and sprinkle, well, I did this, I was in Malta and I did this, I cooked there's an article in the New Yorker, Talk of the Town this week, that, was sort of saying that Pete Buttigieg was great because when he was reading Ulysses, he cooked liver in his kitchen, because that's what they do in the book. And I was just like, well, a lot of people did that. People eat cucumber sandwiches all the time because of that book. What's the deal with that? And I don't think that Elizabeth Warren could run a campaign like that. And I think that in that way, it's very similar.
Does AOC maybe represent the other end of this phenomenon? Like she's the internet candidate who does things like that for black and brown and female voices that haven't been heard?
Yes, and I think that shows sort of the two sides of it, right? Like one is where you have your own crowd, you have your own audience, and you have fans. I think AOC is one of the rare politicians who really has fans. But I think still with presidential campaigns, they're filtered through the mainstream media, through cable news, through everything like that. And I think when that happens, there's still those concerns. Like I still think that filtering always goes one way.
Listeners, if you're just joining us, we have Jay Caspian Kang from the New York Times Magazine, who wrote the piece, How Pete Buttigieg's Meaningless Erudition Made Him the, quote, smart candidate, and Claire Bond Potter, who's a history professor at the New School and had a New York Times op-ed the other day, Men Invented Likeability, Guess Who Benefits. And we can take a few phone calls before we run out of time, or questions from the audience here in the Greene Space. Raise your hand and we'll come around. I see a few hands are up already. Or on the phones, it's 212-433 WNYC 433-9692. Let's take a Greene Space question right now. Hi.
Hi, I'm Jerry. How are you?
Good. We're all good.
How do you put this likability in the context of Donald Trump getting elected? Because even people I know who voted for him, unfortunately I do know some, don't like him. Nobody likes him. They think he's dishonest.
Actually, that's not true that people don't like him. And I discovered this in a very difficult way, which was sitting in an AT&T store in Northampton, Massachusetts, where you think you'd be safe. And I said...
That's like Hampshire College territory,
right.
UMass.
And I said, nobody likes Donald Trump. And a blue-collar guy sitting next to me with his son, I thought he was going to start crying, and he said, that's not true. I like Donald Trump a lot. And I think it says something about how our filter bubbles operate, that often people who don't like Donald Trump, whether they voted for him or not, are not in his spaces. I went to CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference last year, where Trump spoke. And all you have to do is hang out in the line at the women's bathroom after a Trump speech, and you will learn how much Trump's base really likes him. And he likes them too. I mean, the dynamic, and he'll just say, I love you, and they scream, I love you too. It's an extraordinary thing to watch. But I would also like to say, liking someone does not make someone likable. Likable is a term that's made in the media. Right? So a lot of people responded to my piece about Hillary Clinton saying, it's not true that she's not likable. I like her. Well, good for you. But actually, I think some of the stuff that Jay is talking about how things zip around the internet, the preponderance of what is said on the internet, regardless of whether you like her or not. And I've met Hillary. I think she's great. But she's unlikable in the media, and that sticks to her like gum on her shoe.
Another question here. Hi.
Good morning. So my question is, how is it that an ultra-Islamic nation like Indonesia, a macho nation like Germany, and a macho nation like Britain can have Margaret Thatcher, Angela Merkel, and an Islamic woman running as a prime minister, and yet that makes us as Americans really backwards because we can't put a woman in the top office?
Claire, you want to take that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I would answer it in two ways. One is American democracy at this point is so framed by partisanship, far beyond the way it is in other countries. Other countries run their elections very, very differently, and they form coalition governments, and there are multiple parties, and so on. So it's actually easier to form coalitions around ideas rather than personalities in other countries. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing to think about is that many other countries actually have written into their constitutions certain kinds of representation. So there are European countries that actually have said, you have to have 50% women, you know? So there is a kind of structured effort to eliminate gender discrimination in the election process, even though it may not always look that way in the media.
We might even have an answer to this question or a take on this question from a caller. So we're going to go to line 3. Beata in Red Bank. You're on WNYC. Hello, Beata.
Hello.
Hi there.
Yeah, I just want to let you know that, you probably already know that, of course, that in Northern Europe, being likable is kind of considered to be nice, which means it's sort of like a vapid attitude, and it does not really portray character and authenticity. And I'm not talking about the Trump authenticity, but real authenticity is much higher valued than being likable is kind of like, ugh, what else is new? So it would never even become an issue.
Thank you very much. Claire, because you were doing a cross-cultural comparison before, does that ring true to you?
It absolutely rings true. There was a great article in the New Yorker a couple of years ago about Angela Merkel that talked about how important it was that she grew up in East Germany, and how that created a sort of authenticity for her at a moment where integrating the East German economy, but more importantly, the East German worker into a greater Germany was really the primary issue. And so seeing Merkel as somebody who understood that problem, but also had the personality to bridge the cultural gap between East and West became extremely important. And I think character is really the key word here.
We have a question for Jay from Andrew in Brooklyn on line 2. Andrew, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Yes, hello. I just wanted to round out my appreciation for Pete Buttigieg's literary choices and erudition is partly because it's very well-rounded. When you think about his military service and how we're all sort of New York hip, and he's like from South Bend, Indiana, and yet he's still so cool and learned and all this stuff. So I don't necessarily know if it's that he's got a leg up. I think it's just more interesting than a Harvard professor like Elizabeth Warren being erudite. You know what I mean?
Thank you. So, Jay, what about that? If you're assessing Buttigieg, and I realize your article is about a concept,
yeah,
and about how the media works and how public perceptions work, but it sort of targets Buttigieg as the example of that in a negative way, and maybe as the caller is raising, the fact that he was also a military guy rounds him out in a different, unique kind of way.
Sure, and I think that his military service is important. I think it's also symbolically important that he's the first gay presidential candidate running for the Democratic Party. I think those things are important. I think that they matter to his candidacy. I don't know if comparing a Harvard professor to him and saying that he's more well-rounded really makes sense, though. And that's another thing that I objected to, which was just that, like, if you look at the other candidates, some of them also speak other languages, and I was always wondering why Buttigieg just gets attributed to intellectual curiosity. That's the phrase I kept hearing over and over again. Oh, he's intellectually curious. And I was like, well, what does that really mean? It's just like, oh, well, he speaks Norwegian instead of Mandarin, which is what Kristen Gillibrand speaks somewhat. Like, like with Kristen Gillibrand, I think that the response was like, oh, she was just learning Mandarin because it's useful, you know. But with Pete Buttigieg, I think that, you know, oh, well, Norwegian, what a useless language to learn. It must be because he's so intellectually curious and his brain is so capacious that he can just be like, oh, I have this interest. And I was like, look, even if I grant that all that is true, which I wouldn't, because I don't think that that is a good standard to say, even if all that is true, then why does that translate to the office of the presidency? He's the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, which is a town of 100,000 people, and it's a very nice campus town. I went there last year. With some problems that, you know, he's addressed in some ways and hasn't in other ways. But, you know, like, I just, like, this idea of well-roundedness and intellectual curiosity, I also think, I think what it comes down to is that a lot of the people, I grew up very similar to Pete Buttigieg. I grew up in a college town and, you know, similar schooling. And I think that the people who do that oftentimes end up in the media, and when they look for somebody that they want to like, they see somebody who's a little bit like them, you know, and that's where they're like, well, I'm intellectually curious, so he must be also intellectually curious.
We almost, I almost cited a tweet by Chris Hayes, the MSNBC host, in our previous segment when we were talking about de Blasio maybe running for president. Chris Hayes had tweeted regarding de Blasio, I get all the eye rolling, I do, but it's also a little odd that a guy who's run the biggest city in America creditably is perceived as a joke, but the mayor of South Bend is the next big thing.
Yeah. Well, that's because Chris Hayes has actually never been to South Bend, I think. South Bend was the first place I learned that Donald Trump was going to be president, and that was March 2016, when the driver who was bringing me from Chicago to Notre Dame said, absolutely, Donald Trump is going to be president, and I almost jumped out of the car. I was so shocked. But South Bend has actually undergone an enormous economic transformation, and the kind of transformation that New York has not undergone under de Blasio. And this is what happens, actually, when we get into personalities and move away from policies, right? We want Pete Buttigieg to be the next Obama. We want to like him in all the ways we learned to like Obama. But in fact, Pete Buttigieg has navigated elections in an enormously partisan electorate. The same people who elected Mike Pence elected Pete Buttigieg. That's something to pause on. But also, South Bend has become a center for the arts. They're encouraging people to stay there after they've gone to school there. There's been huge development downtown, you know, and at a moment when artists and writers and young people can't get a foothold in New York, people are moving to South Bend because there are tech opportunities and they can have studios for their art. So that's the problem. When we start talking about Ulysses, we're not actually talking about the economic transformations this guy has been in charge of.
And to circle this back around to likability and gender a little bit, when we were talking about him learning Norwegian just out of curiosity as a positive thing, and Kirsten Gillibrand learning it because it's useful as a negative thing, it could even go beyond that, Claire, that with Gillibrand, it's seen as striving in a way that she gets judged for.
Right. Kirsten Gillibrand is cursed. I mean, the fact that she actually announced her presidential bid on the day that the Mueller report was released, I just thought, this is the bad luck girl. I mean, it can't get any worse. But I would also say Kirsten Gillibrand has suffered from the fact that she was the first person who said Al Franken has to go. If Al Franken has done these things, he has to go. And for me, that is, you know, just really, nobody liked her because she said what everybody knew, and now everybody's blaming it on her. And however you feel about Al Franken and what he did, it was consistent with Gillibrand's policy aims, which has been to fight sexual violence and to work on behalf of rape survivors and to make sure sexual harassment laws in the military are being enforced. It would have been inconsistent for her to say, oh, let's just give Al Franken a pass, right?
This is WNYC FM HD and AM New York, WNJT FM 88.1 Trenton, WNJP 88.5 Sussex, WNJY 89.3 Netcong, and WNJO 90.3 Toms River. We are New York and New Jersey Public Radio. We're almost done with our current guests, history professor from the New School, Claire Bond-Potter, who has a New York Times op-ed called Men Invented Likeability, Guess Who Benefits, and New York Times writer Jay Caspian-Kang, who has a magazine piece, how Pete Buttigieg's meaningless erudition made him the, quote, smart candidate. And I just want to take one more phone call from Dave in Westchester on line 3, who has a theory about all of this, I think. Dave, you're on WNYC. Hi.
Hi. Thank you for taking my call. This comes from a failed New Yorker cartoon that was rejected, so full disclosure. I'm a writer and cartoonist, and long time ago, way before Trump ran for president, I came up with this theory about why we pick a president. And it goes back to the patriarchy, the father of our country, and I theorize that the pop culture or the prime electorate chooses a president based on their ideal of patriarchal leader. Okay, so I'm going to say, for instance, we'll start with Jimmy Carter. The prime electorate that voted for Jimmy Carter were children who sat in front of the television set and watched the Andy Griffith Show. Jimmy Carter was our Andy Griffith president. He was the sheriff who kept his bullets and his gun somewhere else. And
what is Donald Trump? What is Donald Trump through this lens?
Okay, well let's
because we don't have time, so I have to.
Okay, a president has a pop culture doppelganger.
That suits
Trump
the times.
Is our Sopranos, mafia, porn type president. Every time I talk to a Trump supporter, I always kind of get around to like, hey, are you a Sopranos fan? Almost always a Sopranos fan, or can quote Goodfellas.
Hard to find anybody who isn't a Sopranos. But Dave, thank you for calling. I'm going to move on. Sorry, because we're really out of time for the segment. But I'll let our guests have one quick go at this. Anything about electing the president who sort of fits our pop culture narratives at the time?
Oh, yeah, sure. I think that's very powerful, especially now. And I think that so much of politics has been ceded to pop culture anyway that I don't know if, maybe Tony Soprano isn't the right one.
Doesn't even
Trump.
have to be Tony Soprano.
Yeah.
It can be Trump for Trump. It can be The Apprentice Trump.
Sure,
For a lot of people, it actually is, literally.
I think Trump is I think it's the person they saw on television. And maybe if they're a little bit older, or at least, as old as I am, the person who they grew up with as being like the coolest rich guy ever and who had like a board game and everything like that. So I think that is true. And I think, just with the candidates right now, I think that people are trying to vote for the aspirational version of themselves, or a lot of people are doing that. And, I think that is a lot of the Buttigieg electorate, which is, they see him as the best case scenario for like what a liberal arts education can produce. Which he might be.
Or they see him as Mr. Rogers.
Sure.
Yeah.
Claire, last
So, there's a media studies professor somewhere writing a book about what Dave just said, I'm sure. But I think the real problem is we don't see the president in the body of a woman, which is part of what Dave is talking about. And I think one of the things Elizabeth Warren is doing, which is very powerful, which she's been doing since she ran to be the first woman senator from Massachusetts, is she gets down on her knees in front of a little girl and says, "Hi, I'm Elizabeth Warren. I'm running for president because that's what girls do." And it's incredibly powerful. And it's that kind of transformation that we need. You need to be able to look at a woman and see a leader, see a president.
Please thank Claire Bond Potter and Jay Castellan Kang. Thank you both so much for a great conversation. Great to have both of you here on the Greene Space stage. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. And now, Greene Space audience, for those of you who have never been here to see the show before, this is going to be the first time witnessing a newscast delivered on a theater stage with Richard Hake. Richard, what's happening?
Thanks, Brian. President Trump has invoked executive privilege and will not have the unredacted Mueller report released. House Judiciary Chairman Gerald Nadler now says there's a constitutional crisis, calling it a blanket defiance of Congress. He says the committee will move forward with a vote to hold Attorney General William Barr in contempt of Congress for failing to comply with the panel subpoena and turn over the full report. The two students accused of killing a classmate and wounding 8 others in a shooting at a school in suburban Denver used at least 2 handguns in the attack. The Douglas County Sheriff says the suspects had a number of weapons, including 2 handguns that they were not old enough to buy or own. There's a tragic story coming out of Harlem this morning. Investigators believe a fire that started in the kitchen caused the deaths of 4 children and 2 adults early this morning. The FDNY responded to the fire on the 5th floor of the Frederick Samuel houses on 144th Street and Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard. Commissioner Nigro says the tragedy weighs heavy on the department.
We're in the business of saving lives, and in this instance, we were not able to. And it's very difficult for our members to deal with this loss also.
The children ranged in ages from 3 to 11, and investigation is ongoing. Some advocates for sex workers and trafficking survivors are lobbying New York state lawmakers to pass 2 pieces of legislation. Karen DeWitt reports from Albany.
The bills would help to partially end the stigma and legal peril associated with sex work by ending the crime of loitering for purposes of prostitution. The sex workers say it is misused by law enforcement. They say it's a device to profile or stereotype certain types of people. Another bill would expunge the criminal records for victims of sex trafficking. Assembly Speaker Carl Hastie says he has not heard much discussion about the issue.
I personally haven't thought too much about it. It hasn't really come up in conference.
The measures also need more backers in the Senate in order for them to come to the floor for a vote, and the sponsors say they are encouraged and are working on getting more supporters.
A state appellate court has ruled that New York City can no longer arrest children who run away from their foster care homes. It's a long-standing practice that's only been challenged recently. WNYC's Morella Ivarak has that.
For at least 30 years, the city's child welfare agency has requested warrants for young people who leave foster care without permission. They say it only happened when children were in grave danger. But the appellate panel ruled that the family court doesn't have legal authority to issue these warrants. Betsy Kramer works at Lawyers for Children.
It's been awful, traumatic, inhumane, and cruel to our clients.
A spokesman at the city's law department says they're considering all legal options, including appeal.
The Health and Human Services Department says drug makers will soon have to reveal the price of their prescription medicines in television and radio ads. The Trump administration will issue final regulations later, requiring drug companies to disclose list prices of any medications costing more than $35 for a month's supply. And 2 New York City residents have won a legal battle with their landlord over privacy concerns. In a settlement, a judge ordered the landlords to give tenants physical keys instead of requiring them to use smartphones to unlock their apartments. Alfred Eng is a reporter for CNET. He says the deal doesn't set a legal precedent, though.
But it definitely encourages more tenants to challenge their landlords on this, because in this case, you saw these tenants go to court and you saw them get what they wanted, which was physical keys.
Lawyers for the landlords told CNET residents were able to punch in a numerical code to enter the building instead of using a phone. They characterized the settlement as a win for both sides. More than 1,000 buildings in New York City have smart locks. It'll be partly sunny today, highs near 63 degrees. Some clouds tonight, lows around 50. More clouds tomorrow with a high near 56. And a chance of rain on Friday, maybe some thunderstorms with a high near 69 degrees. That's the latest from the WNYC newsroom in the Greene Space. I'm Richard Hake.
WNYC is cutting our spring pledge drive in half so we can bring you more programs like All Things Considered Uninterrupted. I'm Jamie Floyd, and the only way we can get you back to regular programming faster is with a strong start. To meet our goal in half the time, we need to raise $200,000 before the drive starts. Call 888-376-WNYC or go to WNYC.org. And thanks.
WNYC is supported by Red Bull Theater's Macbeth. 7 schoolgirls meet up to perform Macbeth in Shakespeare's original text, but the line between real life and blood fantasy quickly blurs. Off-Broadway through June 9th. Tickets at redbulltheater.com. Penguin Books, publisher of Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng. Soon to be a Hulu series starring Reese Witherspoon and Kerry Washington, Little Fires Everywhere is now available in paperback wherever books are sold. Cohen Media Group presenting the new thriller My Son, starring Guillaume Canet and Melanie Laurent. When their son is kidnapped, his estranged parents will stop at nothing to get him back. Starts Friday at Quad Cinema and FIAF's Florence Gould Hall. Join New York Public Radio's Community Advisory Board for a conversation about the 10th anniversary of the Jerome L. Greene Performance Space on Wednesday, May 15th at 6:30 p.m. in the Greene Space. Details at wnyc.org/cab.
It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. We are live in the Greene Space today. Andy Borowitz, the New Yorker humorist, coming up later this hour with news so fake it might be real. And in the meantime, you can watch us do the show in the Greene Space, because when we're in the Greene Space, we stream live video. You can go to WNYC.org or the WNYC Facebook page for that. And with us now in the Greene Space, it's none other than our Trump Inc. team, WNYC's Andrea Bernstein and Ilya Meritz, and ProPublica's managing editor, Eric Umansky. They do the podcast on all the ways the Trump business world intersects with the public interest. Hello, Trump Inkers. Welcome back to the Greene Space.
Hey, Brian.
Hey, Brian. Was your news so real you want it to be fake?
Good one.
I have to remember that. That's the New York Times. The Borowitz report is not. That's the rest of the New Yorker. All right. So, Ilya, let's start with a piece of today's breaking news. Last night, the Times put out a story with some Trump tax return details for a 10-year stretch, 1985 to 1994. As a connoisseur of Donald Trump's finances, what's the headline according to your read?
Well, it's so interesting because it's occurring with the backdrop of the House of Representatives trying to get Donald Trump's more recent tax returns. 1985 feels like a very long time ago. And yet, because what they got is a 10-year stretch of tax information, not tax returns, but tax information, they were able to really shine a light on what his business was at the time. I grew up in New York. I was very little at the time, but I did grow up in New York, so I remember sort of very faintly the acquisition of the Plaza Hotel and when Donald Trump was on the cover of all the magazines. And the headline, to answer your question, is Donald Trump reported over $1 billion in business losses over a decade, and that is more than maybe anybody else in the United States. It is a staggering sum of money, and if you are somebody who gets a paycheck every 2 weeks and gets a W-2, it's pretty hard to fathom how you can have those kind of business losses and still be a very rich man. But that is the situation.
And you tweeted that this, quote, brutally rewrites the narrative Trump crafted in 1987 with The Art of the Deal.
Yeah, I mean, the fascinating subtext to all of this is while Trump is accumulating all of these losses from many different businesses, I should say, from casinos, from getting involved in stock trading, in an airline, trying to get involved in like an alternative football league, and he's losing money everywhere. But while that's happening, he's also co-writing, having a ghostwritten book, The Art of the Deal, which cemented his relationship as the consummate deal maker. And I think what he discovered, Andrea and I were just talking about this, is faking it kind of is making it. And if you sell the public on a story about yourself and you use the tax code, as he has admitted he uses the tax code, you can be a success.
Right. I mean, here we have these hundreds of millions of dollars of losses, as now revealed by the New York Times, in the very time period where his book, which was I'm going to tell you all how to be like me, was on the bestseller list for a year. That was 1987. So he was selling an image of himself very successfully that was completely divorced from reality. And I think sort of fast forwarding, the question that we should be asking ourselves is, how does that affect our current perception of what he says and what he does?
Eric?
There was another tidbit of it that really struck me. I mean, there were an enormous number of really fascinating details in it, apart from the big picture. And one of the things, and it was that word, 3,000 or some such, which was that Trump was also pushing, essentially hyping up hyping up stocks, saying he was going to do a takeover, stocks that he had purchased, so that basically he would pump up the price, and then he would sort of walk away with a profit. So, this goes back to what...
Is that even legal?
I don't know. But, this is, it's quintessential Trump, which is, he is, frankly, something of a savant at performative, at the kind of performance of it all, right? He makes a buck by telling you one thing, doing another, and selling people on an idea. By the way, P.S., he did it a couple of times. People ultimately got savvy to it and didn't respond to his carnival barking, and then he lost a ton of money. It was very much.
And then
he
went on to do completely different things, as
Right.
we've learned. So this period ends in the mid-1990s, and as we now know, among the things he did were foreign licensing deals and The Apprentice, big things that he did. So golf courses is now something that he's in. So his business, sort of what it is, keeps changing, which is one of the very confounding things for us. Is it's not like he's just a real estate developer or even a real estate developer or has even been a real estate developer for decades. It's that he's doing all of these things that are constantly evolving, and we're constantly asking ourselves, what is this?
Right.
So this record is a sense of like the business is the business. The business is making money however he can.
And that brings us to such an interesting question with the president when potentially his tax returns, his recent tax returns could become public. Where would that perhaps reveal a gulf between what we know about him or what he says about himself and what he's reporting to the IRS? Wait and see.
Related is that the Treasury Secretary has said that the government will not release Trump's more current tax returns, as the Ways and Means Committee has requested that they do. But meanwhile, there's a bill working its way through the New York State legislature that would allow the release of Trump's state tax returns because, he files in New York. Eric, any take on this? If it passes, how would that change things?
So again, I should point out I'm not a tax lawyer, I think we would probably find out a bunch of details, but just keep in mind, the Mnuchin refusing to release the returns is happening in a larger context of the administration refusing to respond to Congress in all sorts of ways. We just got news this morning that they are going to refuse to turn over the full Mueller report. We know that they've ordered Don McGahn. McGahn, I'm sorry, the former White House counsel, not to testify, and the list goes on and on. So just because a state may push for something, it's not clear what's going to happen here.
Right. And I just also want to add about Steve Mnuchin. One of the things that's very startling is right after he went and said no one can see the president's tax returns, or shortly after, he went to the Trump International Hotel in Washington and undisclosed to the world, although the Washington Post found out about it, he appeared at a fundraiser for donors. So he's raising money for the president's campaign right after refusing to show the American public the president's tax returns in a hotel in a business that the president is actively profiting from at this moment. And that, in a nutshell, I think sort of shows why everyone should subscribe to Trump Inc., but it shows the fundamental problem and why there are so many conflicts, because the president has not divested. He's actively profiting from his business, which is why his tax returns are so relevant. If they weren't relevant for a million other reasons, which they are.
And it shows that Steve Mnuchin could be the Treasury Secretary and the campaign treasurer at the same time. It seems like another thread of this investigative legal combat on so many fronts that's taking place right now that Trump Inc. has reported on is Deutsche Bank records, Donald Trump's banking records with Deutsche Bank. Who wants to jump in on that and explain why Congress is subpoenaing those particular records, why Deutsche Bank was ready to comply with the subpoena, and why Trump is now, I guess, suing Deutsche Bank to get them to defy the subpoena?
Right. And he's also suing his own accountant to prevent them from releasing information, as well as refusing to give any information to Congress. I think we have an episode coming up later this month about Deutsche Bank. But let me just say in a nutshell that there are a series of really unexplained loans to the Trump organization. So this is a period, we're talking right in the years before he was president, where basically no traditional U.S. bank, not Citibank, not J.P. Morgan Chase, not HSBC, et cetera, these banks would not loan to Trump precisely because of some of the problems with his business, that he kept declaring these losses and then saying to the bank, well, I'm not paying for it, you pay for it, which is essentially what he did. He did that with banks, he did it with stockholders, he did it with business partners, he did it with vendors. So the Deutsche Bank comes in and they loan him a lot of money for several different developments, for the Doral Golf Course in Florida, for the bank, for the old post office development in Washington, D.C., and they were extremely high loan-to-value ratios. So the question is raised, why was Deutsche Bank loaning Trump money? And we don't really quite understand that. They say they were making money and it was profitable for them, but one of the big questions is why? Why were they willing to have a financial relationship? Why were they willing to give him these extremely generous loans with very few strings attached? The other thing that was going on during this period, not related to Trump, but Deutsche Bank was found by New York State financial regulators to have been involved in a multi-billion-dollar money laundering scheme from Moscow to New York. So in something that was called as mirror trades. Now that did not involve Trump or anything to do with Trump, but the New York regulators specifically cited Deutsche Bank for having a culture of sort of non-compliance across the globe. So that's a paraphrase, but that is essentially what they were saying. So is there a connection? We don't know, and so far as we can tell, that's what the New York State Attorney General and various congressional oversight committees are trying to have a window into.
We have to take a short break. We'll continue with our Trump Inc. team in a minute. Listeners, 212-433-WNYC. If you have a question, raise your hands here in the Greene Space. If you have a question, we have a little bit more to cover, including the government's bar tab, that is your taxpayers' bar tab at Mar-a-Lago, the latest Trump Inc. scoop, and a little more. And then Andy Borowitz, the New Yorker humorist, will join us as we segue from news so real you wish it was fake to news so fake it feels like it's real. Stay with us, Brian Lehrer in the Greene Space on WNYC.
On the next Fresh Air, how the junk science of eugenics and anti-immigration sentiment merged in a 1924 restrictive law that kept out Jews, Italians, and Eastern Europeans. A Nazi handbook cited this law as a model for Germany. We'll talk with Daniel Okrent, whose book describes how the scientific racism movement shaped American immigration law. Join us. Weekdays at 2 on 93.9 FM WNYC.
WNYC supporters include the New York City Department of Consumer and Worker Protection, which fights for the rights of all workers in New York City, regardless of job or immigration status. More information at 311 and nyc.gov/workers. WNYC is a media partner for the 41st season of the Brick Celebrate Brooklyn Festival, open to all, presenting performances by Patti LaBelle, Burna Boy, I'm With Her, Chucho Valdez, and more. Details at brickartsmedia.org.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC, live in the Greene Space today with our Trump Inc. team, WNYC's Andrea Bernstein and Ilya Meritz, and ProPublica's managing editor Eric Umansky. They do the podcast on all the ways the Trump business world intersects with the public interest, Trump Inc., and let's see, who gets this one? Well, you can tell me who gets this one. You have a story on Trump Inc. about the Winter White House. The headline of this is The Government's Bar Tab at Mar-a-Lago. This one is not about William Barr, right?
No, it is
Oh,
about...
no, go ahead.
It's about the library bar at Mar-a-Lago, which is a bar in a library. It has a big portrait of Donald Trump in his tennis whites, a well-known kind of portrait. And what the story's really about, certainly the first part of the story, is really about how this one agency, the State Department, sort of woke up to a new reality when Donald Trump became president and started spending all this time at his Winter White House, at his private club, Mar-a-Lago. It's both a residence, it's a country club, and it's a place where he does foreign policy, where he has ordered missile strikes on Syria, a place where he's met foreign leaders. And so the State Department very early on was confronted with this question of how it handles expenses there. And we know that one night in April, a bunch of what were described as White House aides went to the library bar, asked the bartender to leave, and served themselves about $1,000 worth of alcohol. And
I can give a quick list of the alcohol.
Oh,
here.
please,
This is my value add. So we have 16 tequila Patron, 22 Chopin, I'm not sure to pronounce that, 10 Don Julio, Blanco, also tequila, and 6 Woodford Reserve.
Which is bourbon, I think, right?
Which is bourbon, and it all came in at $838. Plus, of course, the service fee for the bartender who was not there.
But they took off taxes, weirdly.
Yes, and they took off taxes. Thanks, God.
I was just at a restaurant the other night, and I happened to notice that the Woodruff Reserve was the most expensive bourbon on the menu, a little above Maker's Mark.
Is that right? So
why do we care about this?
So this bill arrives at the State Department a few weeks later, and the State Department says, we didn't know about this, we're not going to pay. Ultimately, the White House pays. But it kicks off this period where the State Department sort of had to figure out, well, how are we going to spend money at the president's private club? Not only because of who the president is and that he's the boss of the club as well as the boss of the country, but also they basically had to go around a number of federal contracting rules or comply with those rules to make this work. You're really not supposed to put an alcoholic tab. I think generally you're not supposed to bill to the government. Conference rooms, they wanted to bill more than would have been the government rate. And so ultimately what ends up happening is the State Department gets a special Citibank travel card purely for use at Mar-a-Lago. And it's one of these examples of something that we wouldn't know about unless a court had forced the Trump administration to comply with a Freedom of Information request from a group called Property of the People. We have them to thank for these paper records. But this, 2+ years in, this is the unresolved conflict of interest. Active business, active president, and same guy.
You could think about it as a kind of issue of, frankly, petty conflicts, right? It's $1,000. It's not going to bankrupt the U.S. Treasury. But there are some much deeper issues that are going on that are not just sort of conflicts as a general thing. One of the issues with Mar-a-Lago is it is, as a private but profit-making club, the president is incented to keep access to it, right? To bring people in, which is a thing. We reported that there are essentially these kind of tour groups that come in. Well, one of the challenges with access is that can run in tension with security, right? And we've seen these stories about a Chinese national who came in and seemed to have some monitoring equipment. The details of it, aren't quite clear. But you have this very obvious tension between the interest of the president's pocketbook, frankly, the interest of the government's own security.
Before we run out of time, I want to bring up one last loose thread. And Ilya, I think this is in your portfolio too, because you've been reporting on the Trump inauguration and some of the conflicts of interest that arose in the funding of that. Yesterday, a former inauguration staffer named Stephanie Wolkoff made news when she was interviewed or wrote a piece, I forget, for the New York Times and made some accusations. Can you put this in context?
Yeah, so Stephanie Winston Wolkoff, her company was the largest contractor for the Trump inauguration. So there's always been a lot of attention on her because the company took in $26 million, which is a ton of money. That said, I have felt, based on my reporting, that the focus on her is somewhat misplaced. And the fundamental question around the inauguration is the $107 million that was raised, which is about double as much as the next most expensive inauguration, and how it was spent. And we still have not had a full public accounting. But what we have learned, what we've been able to put on the record in our podcast, is that the Trump Organization was paid by his inauguration for use of the Trump International Hotel in D.C., And we've also been able to put on the record the fact that the inaugural chief, Tom Barrack, who's a private equity businessman and a friend of Donald Trump's, had his own plan to profit off of his connections in Trump's Washington. And I think that is where that's where my focus will remain. In addition, there are several investigations by different prosecutors who are looking into possible vectors of foreign donors trying to get their money in, and then perhaps get access to the new administration.
So, Andrea, for a last question, put on your political analyst hat, if you would, and look at the moment that we're in, this post-Mueller report moment of a kind of investigative legal combat on every conceivable front. As you all were mentioning before, tax returns, no, we won't. Unredacted Mueller report, no, we won't. Deutsche Bank records, no, we won't. Don McGahn testimony, no, we won't. Maybe we will even see it, we don't know yet, over Mueller's own prospective testimony. Gerald Nadler, the Judiciary Committee chairman, called it a constitutional crisis this morning. Maybe that's hyperbole or maybe not. How do you see this moment? And politically, do you think the Democrats have to decide if they're doing the work of justice by going down all these rabbit holes into courtrooms, or if they're just political dead-enders, going to be seen that way going to 2020?
So I think that a couple of things. So on the issue of the president's early business, which we were just talking about, this has been standard practice of Trump forever, which is not disclose. We found out when we started in Trump Inc. to try to look into his business, the answer is always no. No, you cannot have, no, you cannot see, no, you can't have this record, many of which have been previously public, and it goes to his presidency and his administration. So after the election, we had an episode of our podcast where we talked about what are all of these new Democrats in House chair positions of committees going to mean. And I think what we're seeing now is it has come to a head that the Trump organization and the White House are behaving the way they normally do, and the Democrats in Congress are trying to exercise their oversight, and that is inevitably going to come into conflict unless Trump all of a sudden says, no, I'm actually going to give you everything, which he has never done yet. Now, as to the political consequences, I mean, I think the Democrats have already decided we're asking for those records. They've not launched impeachment hearings. They've not started more aggressive maneuvers in that way. But just by trying to do their oversight role, they've been thwarted.
With Mitch McConnell going out publicly yesterday and saying, case closed.
And what they've said is, well, we can't just let this go because the Constitution is at stake. So it's not even real. It's beyond a political question from their standpoint at this moment.
Eric, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I do think that there is a fundamental test that we are going to be facing and are already facing, which is that Trump doesn't play by the rules. Right? Many of these things are not written into the law. We're now going to be tested. What real leverage is there? Right? What pressure is there going to be? What is he going to do? And I think the answers to that are very, very unclear.
And there's even more crossing the wire this hour, which we will continue to try to clarify through the day about Trump invoking executive privilege on some of that stuff. I think that's with respect to the unredacted Mueller report, perhaps, or conversations with Don McGahn. So this is continuing to rise as a story and a political challenge as well as a constitutional challenge. For now, we thank the members of our Trump Inc. team, Ilya Meritz, Andrea Bernstein, and Eric Umansky, the managing editor of ProPublica. Please thank our guests.
Thank you.
Thank you. For news so real you wish it was fake, Andrea's new slogan.
And don't forget to subscribe to Trump Inc.
Andy Borowitz next. Stay with us.
WNYC Spring Pledge Drive is just around the corner, and we're cutting it in half. That means more programming with fewer interruptions. I'm Jacqueline Sincata, Program Director of WNYC. We still need to raise $200,000 before the drive starts if we're going to meet our goal in half the time. We can get there with your early donation right now. Please call 888-376-WNYC or go to WNYC.org.
Support for WNYC comes from Sony Pictures Classics presenting All Is True, a new film directed by and starring Ken Branagh as William Shakespeare, returning home to face his past and family after his Globe Theatre burned to the ground. Also starring Judi Dench and Ian McKellen, starts Friday. The Public Theater, presenting the New York premiere of Mohada, a new drama inspired by the ancient Greek story of Medea about love, immigration, borders, and sacrifice. More about Mohada at publictheater.org. Geico Insurance, celebrating over 75 years of providing auto insurance for drivers across America. Geico can also help insure motorcycles, RVs, homes, apartments, and more. Information at geico.com or 1-800-947-AUTO.
This is WNYC, 93.9 FM and AM 820, NPR News and the New York Conversation.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC, live in the Greene Space today. And listeners, when we are live in the Greene Space, you can watch The Brian Lehrer Show as well as listen as we stream live video at WNYC.org or on the WNYC Facebook page. With us now in the Greene Space, New Yorker magazine humorist Andy Borowitz, creator of The Borowitz Report. Now, The Borowitz Report has been covering stories recently like about the first controversy surrounding Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's new baby. And, well, we'll take it from there. Hi, Andy.
How are you doing?
Good, but I understand, and this is serious, folks. This is
Serious.
not satire. This is real. You came in and you said, well, you could actually fill us in on that executive privilege story that I was getting in my ear just before the break. So what do you know?
Yes. Well, you see, this is the problem with my job because I'm always trying to come up with fake news. And so I'll come up with something absurd that Trump might do. And then 10 minutes later, he will actually do that thing. So my news, it's no longer really fake. It's just early. That's kind of the problem. But I just want to make a departure from my usual role when I come on your show, Brian, as you know, is to spout absolute nonsense. I come in and I just tell a bunch of fake headlines and misinform everybody. But I couldn't help, because you've been hard at work at the Greene Space for the last 40 minutes or so. You've been kind of in a bubble, not a liberal bubble, which you're always in, but in sort of a news-free bubble. And you haven't heard the big news that, in fact, Trump is, for the first time in his, this is real news, folks. This is not a joke. For the first time in his presidency, and God, I hate using that word, but in his presidency, he is asserting executive privilege to keep the unredacted Mueller report from being released. That is, you can actually Google that when you leave the Greene Space.
And I have a quote here now. I just looked it up on
Isn't this cool? We're doing real news.
The New York Times
So
website.
cool.
This could be CNN.
Yeah, it could be.
This could be.
It could be, absolutely. Except no, we'd have to have the font saying, waiting for news about Mueller report underneath us, because that makes it really exciting.
I think they used that same font for about a year and a half.
Maybe they did.
A Justice Department official, Stephen Boyd, wrote Wednesday morning, quote, this is to Congress, this is to advise you that the president has asserted executive privilege over the entirety of the subpoenaed materials, unquote, and that particularly, as the Times puts it, was to shield hidden portions of Mueller's unredacted report and the evidence he collected from Congress. Okay.
Now,
So
a couple things are weird about that.
Yes.
Okay. First weird thing is, from my understanding of William Barr's summary of the Mueller report, this is a report that fully exonerated Trump, okay? I mean, if you go on Amazon and you Google the Billy Joel song, An Innocent Man, it says you may also like the Mueller report. That's how innocent. I mean, it is like, it's basically like, I don't know, it's you have had the most, it's like saying, I want to keep people from finding out I won an Oscar. Like, it's an incredible honor. Basically the Mueller report was a love letter to his innocence and his non-collusion and his non-obstruction, and we're not going to get to read that now. It seems uncharacteristically modest of Trump, if I might add. Usually is the kind of thing he wants to put out there, but I think he just doesn't want us to feel envious of just how innocent he is. I think that's the only conclusion I can draw.
I did read on the Borowitz report that the Trump administration was getting some outside help from Moscow redacting the Mueller report. Can you tell us who was?
Well, yeah, that was Putin in the weeks ahead, leading up to it. He surrounded himself with a bunch of his cronies, and they were going through with a Sharpie, I think it's called a Sharpovskaya or something like that. And they were going through it and just trying to make sure. There was something like, I think, between 7,000 and 8,000 references to Russians in the report, and they want to make sure those are all gone. So they did work on it. It's sort of sad to me, Brian, to see how this story has ended, because I was looking forward to this.
How did Putin feel about having to take on yet another political project on behalf of Donald Trump?
Well, he's had it up to here. I mean, he really has. His basic attitude is, do I have to do everything for these people? And that's... it's justifiable. He's got a country to run too, And also, he's got to start worrying about 2020, It's not like he can just sit around. He's got a lot to do.
Although he couldn't be too unhappy about his role supporting Trump, because I see on the Borowitz report that the Kremlin has named its employee of the month.
Yes, Donald Trump. Yes, done it for his service to the fatherland. I've repurposed that story many different months, in fact. What's always hard about this, Brian, is that you're always so much more familiar with what's on the Borowitz report than I am. So it's a little bit like it's a strange kind of SAT quiz for me.
And listeners, we can take phone calls for Andy Borowitz.
They will be redacted, however, just in keeping with our new system of justice.
After the fact for the podcast version of the Brian Lehrer Show. 212-433-WNYC. And audience here in the Greene Space, if you have any question to ask what do you call yourself? Is it editor-in-chief? Is it, what are you, of the Borowitz report?
Of the Borowitz report? I am just the Borowitz, I guess, is my title. I mean, people are always saying, like, people hate something I do. They say, you better get some new writers. And I'm like, I wish, It's like, this is it, man. It's all I got.
All right, your questions for the Borowitz, of the Borowitz report, you can raise your hands here in the Greene Space, or 212-433-WNYC, 433-9692. I did see that on the Borowitz report, Attorney General William Barr has had time, despite all the redaction work, to read not just the Mueller report, but also some classic literature.
He did. He read Moby Dick. He had waited for years. I know, I got it right. He had waited years to read Moby Dick, and then he finally read it in about, I think, 8 minutes or so. And it was interesting, his take on Moby Dick. He said he found no evidence of whales, which was interesting. I guess, it shows that sometimes you can't believe the hype, right?
Maybe Putin redacted all the whale scenes in Moby Dick.
Now my head is exploding as you cross-post two of my stories.
Did I see a hand up over here?
Yeah, there was a hand up.
Let's
change the subject away from this
microphone. You have the microphone. Go ahead.
Mr. Borowitz, we need your help, the Democrats, as the list of candidates who've declared approaches 24. Mm-hmm. I find it kind of hard to keep them straight. Mm-hmm. Do you have a classification system that you use to group them into more easily remembered categories?
Well, it's interesting. There are a lot of candidates, Democratic candidates, and that's another thing that happened while you were on the air, which is Boys to Men have just announced that they're running. It's incredible. Wilson Phillips is going to run now. It's like a whole bunch of people got into it. So it is hard to sort of sort them out. I actually keep them in sort of one category, which is any of them are better than Trump. So I actually don't. I'm actually not playing favorites. There's Will Rogers, who's probably the greatest American political satirist, had a good line one time. Somebody asked him what his political affiliation was, and he said, "I'm not a member of any organized political party. I'm a Democrat." And sadly, prescient. It's one of those timeless remarks that you wish weren't so timeless. But I always, in all seriousness, I like to quote somebody who I think was a great politician and terrible president, Ronald Reagan. Because when he was running, he had a really good sort of rule that he laid down. He said the 11th commandment should be, "Thou shalt not speak ill of another Republican." And I think the Democrats should just steal that because it's a really good idea. I think we are in a state of emergency and we do not have the luxury to beat each other up. That's my take on that. Sorry for that little Are you gonna have to give Steve Bannon equal time now, Brian?
Yes.
Because I made a little political pitch there.
Mr. Bannon, call in, and
Okay,
we
absolutely.
will give
We'd
you
love to
equal
hear from
time.
him.
We did Evelyn Patton on yesterday. So
Oh,
it's
okay. All right.
So what is this controversy I see on the Borowitz report about this new royal baby?
Well, it was sort of a tempest in a teapot. I don't think it has a lot of traction. But just on Monday morning, Donald Trump was very upset that another baby was getting all the attention. It was just, some of you with kids know how it is. The new baby comes home and the old baby is a little bit put out. Because Trump, by his own description, he is used to being the youngest person. He's young, he's vibrant. And then to see another kid come into the picture who's even younger and perhaps more vibrant, it's got to be upsetting. So he didn't take it well. Do
you think it explains anything about tariffs on China or anything else?
Yeah, well, I think that he did try to do those tariffs and all that as a way to take attention away from the royal baby. But it was a desperate situation. I think we can forgive him that. I think most child care experts would say it's just a phase. He'll eventually come to love the baby, I think. When the baby can start talking, I think.
We have another question here in the Greene Space.
Yes.
Hello, in the back.
So this is a question you can answer in a funny way or in a serious way, but how would you advise humorists in the United Kingdom to find anything funny about the situation at the moment?
In the United Kingdom?
In the United Kingdom, regarding Brexit.
Regarding Brexit. Well, that's funny because I actually, it's all a question of perspective, which is that to you, in the United Kingdom, Brexit is not funny at all. It's like this scimitar hanging over your heads. To me, living with what I'm living in this country, it's really comic relief. I just turn on the BBC and it's like, oh, finally, for a moment, I can think we're not the biggest dumbasses in the world. There is actually somebody. Could I say that, Brian, on NPR?
You just did.
I guess I did. But no, really, it's just nice to know. It's very reassuring to see that there's another country, perhaps even more dysfunctional than we are. It's like we're not, although there are similar things I say, like it's not like we're pulling out of the northern hemisphere or but in a sense we are, aren't we? So, but I feel. How are you taking the whole Brexit thing? Are you? How do you feel about the backstop? I love when they talk about the backstop. Does anyone in this room even know what the backstop is? That's how little we care about what you're going through. They don't even know what the backstop is.
The Irish backstop, right?
Yeah, the Irish. No, you know because you're a news person. You see the feed and you read about the backstop. I urge everybody in here to read up about the backstop. It is hilarious. No, it's just you basically, somebody made a really good comment. I don't know who, but it was a really good quote. And it's the problem of referenda in general. You had a referendum. That's why we should not have referenda in this country when it can be avoided at any level, which is that the whole idea of representative government is you're supposed to have representatives who read up on this stuff and then they make decisions. We're not supposed to all vote and then say, oh, let's do this or let's do that. And somebody compared Brexit to basically voting on whether or not you should build a ship out of butter. And it's like, yeah, we can all agree to that, but then how are we going to make that ship actually work as a ship? So that's kind of the problem. I don't remember who said that, but I like the analogy. So anyway, are you thinking of perhaps another country to live in now? Is that a possibility?
Well, I'm actually a U.S. citizen.
You are really messed up then. Well, nowhere to go.
Well,
You're a U.S. citizen. So you live here in New York?
Yes, the day after I became a U.S. citizen, they decided to try and repeal the Voting Rights Act, so I timed it perfectly.
I see.
What I find interesting about Britain is that nobody in any political class or even in the country has any idea what is either going on or is going to happen next. And what's even more extraordinary is that that's taken place after numerous votes, many years of activity, that all these scenarios that could have existed before still exist now. So it's a perpetual state of action without any consequence. So I don't know how you make something funny out of that.
Are you the guy who did the Planet Earth documentaries? You sound very familiar to me. Is that another guy? No, he should be working at WNYC. What a voice. That's amazing. That's amazing. I just didn't hear a thing you said. I was just saying I said, that just sounds smart. Whatever he said sounded so smart. And I think he said, nobody knows what we're doing. And I said, oh, that sounds so astute.
As opposed to this country where everybody thinks they know exactly what the right
That's
answer
right.
is, whether or not they have any information.
That's for sure.
Okay.
That's for
so,
sure.
because we were talking about the royal baby, and
Yes.
this is real, they seem to have just released the name of the baby at this moment, I guess because they heard us talking about it. And the name is, and this is real, this just came across my
They're naming
iPad
him
here.
North, right? Isn't that?
North?
North?
After
No, oh, that was
Oliver.
taken, all right. Okay. What is it? What it's going to be?
Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor. Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor.
Archie, not Jughead? They just went, what's wrong with Jughead is catchier. Archie, I love how they're clinging to that Mountbatten thing. You know, that's Prince Philip's name.
Archie and Mountbatten Windsor don't really go together that well.
No, they don't. They don't. And Mountbatten, honestly, it's a made-up name because it was originally a whole different kind of German deal. So I wonder why they changed that.
I'm going to have to
Google it.
Look again and see if it wasn't Arthur, but I think it's Archie.
Archie, okay.
So with this new reporting in the Times today, they got 10 years of Trump tax returns and saw that he lost $1 billion over that decade. The Borowitz report reveals he may be stepping away from his businesses. What's the scoop?
Well, he spent many years bankrupting his various businesses, and he wants to devote all of his energies now to just bankrupting the country. You know, that's what he feels like. He needs to put America first. But I was really stunned by that news about the $1 billion because just to put that in some perspective, well, how much money that is. Just you see a number like that and it says, what does that mean? $1 billion is enough to silence 8,000 porn stars. Just to give you an idea what that money could have been put to use for. So that's a pretty staggering loss, it seems to me. When you really consider it.
And Trump usually sees no conflict between his business and his government work.
He's great at both of them. He's so amazing.
He could bankrupt both at the same time.
Yeah, both at the same multitask.
You wrote on the
Borowitz report. A long time ago, though, Brian.
By the way, I am confirming that it is Archie. Somebody raised in my ear, are you sure it isn't Arthur? No, it's Archie. Multiple news sites are reporting Archie.
But it's Archie. Okay.
Harrison Mountbatten Windsor. What's his nickname going to be?
Arch, right? Arch. I'm going to call him Arch, I think.
An Arch?
Maybe Prince.
An Arch?
Prince would be good. They both sound like dog names, oddly enough. So does Rex, for that matter.
I'm glad to see the Justice Department is getting serious about something, though. The Borowitz report has the latest on the Hillary Clinton-Abraham Lincoln investigation.
Oh, my God. Yes. Yes, Fox really sort of stirred this up again. There's new evidence that Hillary Clinton killed Abraham Lincoln. It's time to move on from the whole Mueller thing and really get back to Hillary. Because Hillary, God knows, she's really gotten away with so much over the years. Murders, all this stuff, and really killing the president. President Lincoln was a terrible thing with her time travel machine.
And you reported that Hillary is falling back on some kind of flimsy chronological argument.
Yeah, as always. You know, the Clintons have a way of arguing their way out of anything, and I think she'll do that. I think, Brian, as you're going through these, you're just sort of putting a big X as you do one of these Borowitz reports.
So I don't.
I feel some way. It's hurtful. I thought you were going to take them home. I thought you were going to take them home and enjoy them all over again. And sure, he's just like, X, we did that one. All right, what's this one? I guess we got to do this one now.
I could put smiley faces, but
yes,
either way.
True.
So I
you
don't
might be
ask
doing
you the
checks, actually.
Same question twice.
Exactly.
But we in the media do have to take responsibility for our biases, and I see that the Borowitz report tells us that Sarah Huckabee Sanders is leveling a new accusation at basically the whole news media.
Yes. Well, after she did this thing, I guess she was under oath. And putting Sarah Huckabee Sanders under oath is just sort of a nightmarish task for her, I'm sure, and for everybody involved. But she was under oath, and they asked her, I guess, about her comment that all these FBI agents hated James Comey and thought he was doing a terrible job. And they asked her to sort of give some factual basis for that. And she said, well, actually, that was not based on any fact. So that was her explanation. There was no factual basis behind this thing that she said from the podium at the White House. And April Ryan, a journalist at CNN, said that she should resign because of telling that lie. So Sarah Huckabee Sanders came out in a very strongly worded statement saying that the media was showing a very blatant anti-liar bias. That, lying is a lifestyle. It's a lifestyle choice she's made. And it really shouldn't be up to the media to say, no, you can't live your life that way. You should be free to love whatever lies you love. And that's her feeling.
Please thank Andy Borowitz.
And thank you, Brian Lehrer.
Report. Quick note about something else coming up here at the Greene Space. The New Yorker writer Hilton Als is artist in residence in the Greene Space this spring. And this Tuesday, May 14th, he'll be speaking with poet Shane McRae and composer Michael R. Jackson about how art reflects contemporary life. Tickets for The Way We Live Now, Hilton Als and America's Poets are at wnyc.org/The Greene Space. Audience, thank you so much for coming out on a Wednesday morning to the Greene Space. And everybody, thanks for listening.
WNYC is supported by John Theurer Cancer Center at Hackensack University Medical Center, part of the Memorial Sloan Kettering Hackensack Meridian Health Partnership. Learn how John Theurer Cancer Center is pioneering the possible at jtcancercenter.org. Your part-time controller, helping nonprofits